The whole definition of what life is about has shifted. We have been through really what I consider the perfect storm. In these difficult circumstances, the most scarce and most valuable resource is hope. Better days will come, just need to stay faithful and stay concentrated on what we're trying to achieve and believing that better days will come, and then that's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
At one point, everybody was looking at me to help us get through this crisis. And there were definitely times where the pressure from that moment of, can I do this? And maybe this is why I'm here in this moment, because I can make that difference.
There were moments where I completely doubted my ability to go out my own and allow myself to be a leader. I don't know how big my voice can be or if my voice is big enough, but I'm gonna try and realize that the work that is out there is necessary.
And I've had to put energy into, okay, where are people at right now? People need to feel value and valued. If we can do that, that will be the enabler for us to continue to listen and reach out with empathy.
People will change you and help you become a more expansive, more generous version of yourself is something that would have been important for me to hear in the beginning of the pandemic, and I think continues to be important for us all to hear.
The pandemic has caused me, and I'm sure many others, to reevaluate. We really need to not forget the new ways of doing things that lift the boats for everybody, taking advantage of the time that we've had to pause, rethink, and reset.
You can decide to be a victim and feel that there's nothing you can do, or you can empower yourself and try to do something about it.
If I have learned nothing else during this pandemic, it is the power of community to come together and not just demand change, but to create it when no one else will. There's the old story of the phoenix that rises from the ashes, and whether that phoenix rises or not depends on each of us.
Hello, I'm Tommy Loper, Vice President of Leadership Programs and co-founder of the Resnick Aspen Action Forum. I'd like to welcome all the Aspen Global Leadership Network fellows, moderators, partners, family, friends, and staff of the Aspen Institute who are here with us right now. Our program is also being live streamed on our Aspen Institute channels, and I welcome everyone who is here with us to learn more about collective leadership. The Aspen Global Leadership Network, or AGLN, is a growing worldwide community of 3,500 high-integrity, values-based leaders using their resources and platform to make the world a better place. And for nearly a decade, this community has come together at the annual Action Forum to reflect, recharge, and recommit to addressing the most pressing challenges in our organizations, communities, and society. We recognize how extraordinarily challenging this last year has been. It is times like these that are at the core of why the Aspen Institute was founded. The Institute was created as a place for people to come together, discover common humanity, aspire to become better leaders, and find hope for the future, a mission that lives on today. The pandemic is a powerful example of how our futures are all connected and how differently people and communities are impacted by the inequities deeply rooted in our systems and structures. The challenges laid out in front of us are too great for any one person to solve. They require a collective approach. In the days to come, we will explore our theme, collective leadership. What does it take in a polarized world? Zooming in from around the world are 350 adults representing each fellowship program in the AGLN and 60 youth. The next few days are a learning journey for each of us and the AGLN community as a whole to better understand what it takes to lead collectively in the world today. Before we begin this week, I'd like to thank David Rubenstein, Jillian and Robert Steele, Margot and Tom Pritzker, and the John P. and Ann Welsh McNulty Foundation for the longtime support of this community. My thanks as well to the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth and the global law firm Paul Hastings. And my deep thanks to Linda and Stuart Resnick for believing in this community, the year-round work that we do, and a commitment to bring us together at the Resnick Aspen Action Forum through 2031. I know many of us wish we were physically together in Aspen, Colorado. I do too. we will be there next year. I hope you find that the week ahead transports you to a place of peace, reflection, and renewed commitment to having a positive impact. In a minute, my friend and colleague, Phil Javiana, will join us to take us through the day. But first, please allow me to introduce you to the Aspen Institute's president and CEO, Dan Porterfield. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. Welcome to our 2021 Resnick Aspen Action Forum. My thanks to all colleagues, participants, and sponsors who have made this virtual convening possible. And I love the theme, collective leadership. What does it take in a polarized world? It's so important that we ask ourselves what polarization looks like and feels like and does in different societies and different social contexts. Where does it come from? How does it spread? What can be done about it? What role can leaders play? And to what extent are we being drawn into some of the very forms of polarization that we decry? These are defining questions for 2021, but they're not exactly new. After all, the Aspen Institute was founded in 1949 in the aftermath of 15 years of increasing polarization that finally boiled over into the tragedies of genocide, World War II, forced migration, nuclear devastation, and more. Our first convening was an international conference in the sleepy silver town of Aspen, Colorado. It was dedicated to the thought of the 19th century humanist Goethe. In its design, this conference reflected our founders' belief in collective leadership. Walter and Elizabeth Pepke convened business leaders, artists, academics, humanitarians, and government leaders, people who didn't normally think and work together at that time. When they met, the Goethe Conference must have felt inclusive because it was international and because of the diversity of professions that were included. Today, though, we also see it as very Western, very white, and very male. But it clearly contained the seeds for the greater inclusion that we prize and still work for today. And it certainly recognized that business communities can and must be partners in building a good society and not just spectators. In addition to collective leadership, those who founded the Institute believed in a few ideas that remain great resources for us today. One is that ideas matter. A second is that values matter. A third is that dialogue matters. A fourth, that action matters. A fifth is that cultures matter, existing not in isolation, but in contact, exchange, and breakthrough. And finally, I would argue that the greatest insight of our founding and the core resource we have for dealing with polarization and other all too human phenomena like hatred, racism, violence, and alienation is the idea that each person all across the planet has human dignity. In 1950, our first board of trustees called dignity, quote, the animating value of the new institute. Dignity is the concept that all humans have equal, intrinsic, and inalienable value. Whether we know each other or not, whether we agree with each other or not, whether we live near each other or not, whether we worship the same way or not, whether we look like each other or not, whether we even like each other or not. Dignity doesn't dissolve our differences. It recognizes and values them because they are part of the humanity that we all share. So, if we believe in human dignity, then we must come together collectively to share life stories and wisdom, to learn together, to discuss differences, to bear witness to each other's pain, to build bridges of understanding. To paraphrase Dr. King, we will do these things as brothers and sisters, or we will perish as fools. This can sound easy, I know, but it's actually very hard because honoring each other's dignity requires humility, learning, listening, respect, inclusion, empathy, tolerance, conflict resolution, all things that we value in the AGLN. It requires a serving spirit, honesty, optimism, and the willingness to change. It requires hope, love, and for many, faith. Honoring each other's dignity is one of the greatest callings we humans have, and it is the very opposite of polarization. So, as we take on a tough topic this year, let us draw upon our many collective assets, our experiences, our ideals, our friendships, our networks, our commitments to values-based leadership, and our belief in human dignity. Thank you, and best wishes for a productive Resnick Aspen Action Forum.
Thanks, Tommy and Dan. And hello, friends around the world. I'm Phil Javiana, and I'll be your host today. We are here live at the Aspen Institute headquarters in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the 2021 Resnick Aspen Action Forum. Collective leadership, what does it take in a polarized world? We have a great day ahead. We'll talk to leaders about their views on why we're so polarized, why it seems we're living in different realities, and what it might take to build trust in our communities. We'll hear from fellows in the Aspen Global Leadership Network who are making a real impact right now. And importantly, we'll start a dialogue. At the Aspen Institute, we pride ourselves in promoting and prompting more questions than answers. So, as you're listening today, you might find yourself wanting to explore these topics more. We believe that the best way to do that is in community with others. So think of this plenary as the start of a conversation. If you're watching our live stream at home, invite a friend or family member to join you. If you're attending the Action Forum as a participant, bring your thoughts to your seminar dialogue this week. And for those of you in the Action Forum Zoom room, join our speakers in a Q&A immediately after our last conversation today. Instructions will be given inside the Zoom. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first conversation led by Rima Maktabi. Rima is the London Bureau Chief of Al Arabiya News and a fellow of the Middle East Leadership Initiative. She's covered for the past 20 years conflicts across the Middle East, and we're thrilled to have her lead a conversation on subjects she knows all too well, conflict and polarization. Welcome, Rima.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for having me. So hello, everyone, and I'm coming to you from Beirut, Lebanon, and I'd like to welcome the esteemed panelists today. Eric Liu, he's a writer and a founder of Citizen University and executive director of Citizenship and American Identity program, and also joining us, Amanda Ripley. She's an author of High Conflict. That's only one of her latest books. She's written so many books in the past, and she's also an investigative journalist for The Atlantic and other outlets. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And as I mentioned, I'm coming to you from Lebanon. It's the land of all conflicts. And if you go south from where I am, I'm in Beirut, in the capital. There's the Israeli/Palestinian territories, and needless to say that this is the mother of all conflicts of the Middle East and the source of trouble for Middle East politics over the past tens of years. If you go north, it's Syria, and everyone knows what's happening in Syria. And in the larger context, it's the Middle East. And we all know how troubled the Middle East is. And it's all because we are polarized. We are witnessing bloody conflicts. And I'll start this conversation with a very brief story. Last night, of all places, I joined some friends, and some of them, they were from the US. And 3 of them were Republicans and 2 were Democrats. And despite we are in a country that's witnessing major financial and political crisis, the topic was about US politics. It started to get heated, and suddenly one of them said, let's just not discuss this. Let's all stay silent, avoid this topic, or else it's gonna end up in a bad discussion or in a bad conflict. Amanda, my first question is to you. Is remaining silent an option? And then the floor is yours to comment on this topic. Why are we so polarized?
Thank you, Rima. It is so good to be here with all of you, and particularly to have your voice from a place that has seen so much violent conflict. there is an irony, isn't there? There's a paradox that happens in intractable conflict where people on the extremes seem to get louder and louder, right? Especially on social media or TV news. And then everybody else gets quieter. And we see this happen all over the world, right? Where in the US, just to take one example, half of Americans say they have stopped talking to someone because of something they said about politics. And two-thirds say that they have a political view they're afraid to share. So we know enough about human psychology to know that conflict, when you stifle it, doesn't go away. It goes underground, it ferments, it becomes hardened, and it's understandable. So it's understandable that you would have some people getting louder and some people getting quieter. So both behaviors are normal and dangerous, right, in different ways. And I remember actually after Trump was elected here, going to my husband's family for Thanksgiving in New Jersey, as we always do. And I walk in the door and there's signs that some of the younger cousins had posted. These are like in college. The signs say, no talking about politics. So this thing that was on everyone's mind, we weren't allowed to talk about. And it's not like it's gotten better since then, right? So I'm curious if you know, how that works in Lebanon. Do people talk about conflict more openly given how intense the conflict is?
Yes, of course they do. And sometimes it gets into a bloody conflict. So a simple discussion over dinner, or people are queuing now for fuel in Lebanon. There's a lack of fuels, and the waiting hours and the tense discussions can lead to a fight where the army or the local securities can interfere. Yes, I'm coming from a part of the world where the concept of high conflict that you talk about is not very common. So if you tell us more about high conflict.
So one of the things that I've learned in spending the last 5 years following people who were stuck in very intractable conflict all over the world and then shifted out is that the problem isn't conflict, to your point. The problem, conflict makes us better, right? It's how we stand up for ourselves. It's how we get pushed and challenged in our families, in our communities, in our churches and mosques and synagogues. That's how we get better. The problem is high conflict. So high conflict is a kind of conflict where it escalates to a point that it takes on a life of its own. And there's been a lot of really fascinating research into this, but we know that in high conflict, once it starts, it's very magnetic. It becomes an us versus them kind of feud. Humans make many more mistakes in high conflict. We literally lose our peripheral vision, like literally and figuratively. So we miss things, we miss opportunities, we make mistakes. Right now, just to take another quick example, currently Democrats in the United States think there are twice as many Republicans who have extreme views than actually do, and vice versa. And this is partly fueled by this paradox of some people getting louder, right? So we know that 97% of tweets about national politics are posted by 10% Twitter users. So you get this effect where it seems like everybody, especially on the other side, has lost their mind. And so it has this effect of perpetuating the conflict, and then eventually it becomes conflict for conflict's sake. Yeah. So what you really want is to shift out of that into good conflict, the kind where there are some rules of engagement.
And here where my question is to Eric, and the floor is yours. Why are we so polarized, and how do we get to good conflict?
Well, Rima, thank you for that. And thanks to everybody for being part of this gathering. It's really exciting to engage in this topic. And I want to tell you a little bit about this question from an American perspective, although I think the ideas that I want to share here are completely relevant worldwide. I think that part of the why has to do not just with the circumstances of this moment, but recognizing deep tectonic shifts here in the United States, for instance. And I think any society can kind of find its own version of these in the United States, the grinding levels of inequality that have unfolded over the last 3-4 decades, the profound demographic shifts that are changing our notion of who is us and creating a lot of status anxiety across the board. Those are some of the drivers of polarization, of course, social media. But there's something I want to zoom out and actually remind us of, and it's something that Amanda alluded to when she said that conflict itself is not the problem. In my work at the Aspen Institute, in the program that I lead here, we have a project called the Better Arguments Project. And the premise of that project is that as polarized and toxic as our civic and political life are right now, we don't need fewer arguments, we just need less stupid ones. And that's not to be glib. I think actually one of the things that Amanda and others have really shown is that there are ways to argue that are more constructive or more destructive. But even more than that, it is recognizing that in the American civic and political context, argument is not just okay, argument is the point. American civic life is an argument. In American civic life, we are torn perpetually by design between liberty and equality, between a focus on strong central national government and local control, between the pluribus part of our motto, e pluribus unum, and the unum part of our motto, and on and on. There are these tensions that are baked into the American system of self-government. And the point of living like a citizen is not to have one side or the other of these polar tensions achieve quote unquote final victory. God help us if one side achieves final victory in one of these tensions. You don't want a society that's only about liberty and not about equality, or vice versa. But the point is actually to be able to navigate those tensions perpetually and healthily. And so we've created this project that begins with that premise, number one, that it's possible, it's necessary to argue, but that what does it mean then to have better arguments? Well, better arguments are those that in the first place are honest about power and power differentials. They're arguments that have some measure of emotional intelligence in the way that Amanda was alluding to. And they are arguments in which you recognize and acknowledge the place of history and the ways in which this is not just an argument that popped up without context right now for you in this moment. And in the work that we've done around the United States, you'd think that a lot of these argument settings are just left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, like Rima, you experienced at dinner last night. And yes, those are many of them. But remember, these kinds of arguments in civic life can unfold around other tensions as well. In a city like Detroit, the tensions have been between long-timers and newcomers. And the long-timers tend to be Black, and the newcomers tend to be white. The long-timers have struggled through decades of a city going through so much grinding, crunching change, and the newcomers are more economically privileged and arriving as if they're getting to remake the city without paying attention to its past. Those tensions don't map a left-right Republican-Democrat axis, but they are as polarizing and as visceral as some of what you might see in national politics. And these principles, we've laid out 5 principles of better arguments, which I can talk about in a moment. But I think as to how we got here, it's recognizing partly these circumstances of demography and economic inequality, and partly, at least in the American context, because it's in our operating system. We're supposed to argue, and left unchecked, left without intentional cultivation of self and circumstance, things get polarized this way.
I'll pass the question to Amanda, because we have the US example now that Eric is talking about it. If we look at the broader picture and the bigger perspective, are there societies capable of avoiding conflicts or high conflicts more than others, or countries?
There are definitely many societies at the micro level and the macro level that have, for periods of time, developed the traditions and rituals that tend to cultivate good conflict, right? Some of which Eric mentioned. And there's ways in which it's easier to see at the institutional level, right? One of the stories that I write about in my book is about a synagogue actually in New York City that almost blew up in internal conflict over Israel, which happens in a lot of synagogues in the United States. And typically rabbis just don't talk about Israel because it's so radioactive, to this point about avoidance, right? But what happens is people suppress their opinions and they don't go away. So in this case, the conflict spilled out onto the front pages of the New York Times. The rabbis were more left, the congregation was more right. People were saying terrible things, leaving the synagogue. It was pretty awful. And the rabbis tried to make the problem go away, which is what most of us do in conflict. And then it didn't go away, it kept coming back. So they, to their credit, brought in some mediators who had worked with Israelis and Palestinians. And they spent a year creating new traditions and rituals and routines that intensely went into conflict with guardrails, right, that Eric talks about. And they managed to, it took a year. It was hard work, right? It's not, I mean, it sounds really like, starry-eyed, and it's actually not. It took a year of, 25 different conversations and having sort of rules of engagement that everyone came up with and agreed to, getting curious, not trying to persuade, all those kinds of things. And eventually, after a year, people started to actually feel moments of delight in profound conflict. And if you've ever experienced this, it is truly exhilarating. Like, it's a strange, transcendent feeling, and you want more of it. So the next conflict that blew up or threatened to blow up the synagogue was about interfaith marriage. And they knew what to do. They went into it with the same rituals and routines. They had hard conversations to get to the understory of the conflict, the thing it's really about that we never talk about. And they get curious in that conflict. So it is certainly possible.
So just in 2 minutes for each, because I'm running out of time, is there hope? Does it look better as we look at the future? Eric?
Well, I think there always is hope, but the hope is not because of something outside us in the future. The hope is whether we make a commitment. And I think this collective leadership emphasis at the Action Forum today really underscores this. There are 5 principles to a better argument that I just want to rattle off to invite you all watching and listening to inhabit them. Number 1, take winning off the table. It is incredibly possible to have a better conflict and a better argument if the point is to understand rather than to win or crush the opponent. Number 2, prioritize relationships and listen passionately. Silence or quiet can be okay if what you're doing is truly listening deeply and not just checking out or avoiding. Number 3, pay attention to context, especially cultural context. Arguments don't happen in some rationalist intellectual vacuum. They happen in cultural context, as you know well, Rima. Number 4, embrace vulnerability. Admit your doubt, admit your pain, admit your fear, and the others will reciprocate over time if you have faith and commit to that. And finally, number 5, make room to transform. You can't possibly change someone else's mind if you're not willing to have your own mind changed. And leaving that space helps make a better argument. And I think if we can commit to these principles, there is hope. And if we can't, no amount of program, no amount of anything else is going to change things.
Amanda?
Yes, I mean, I actually feel like there is a huge unmet demand in the United States and in other hyperpolarized countries for something else. And the more miserable people get, the more opportunity, ironically, there can be. And when I talk now to members of Congress or gang members or even, rebel fighters in Colombia, I see the same fatigue, the same exhaustion, the same desperate desire to get out if only they knew the path, right? And that is typically what you need. You need to hit that saturation point. And then there is an opportunity, and it's a lot easier if people can do it as a group. There is an opportunity to make that shift. And the first, I love Eric's principles. I think that all makes sense. For me, the prerequisite that makes all of those things easier, which he mentioned, is listening deeply. 50% of what people want in conflict is to be heard and understood, even if you still disagree deeply. That is a huge skeleton key that opens up conflict. I swear, I know it sounds a little squishy. It is like magic. And once you can work on those skills, which almost none of us have, by the way, so it takes some practice. Once you work on those skills of deep listening and understanding, then you get amazing returns on conflict.
Mm-hmm. To wrap, before the time catches us, stay tuned. There will be the Leading Through the Pandemic of Disinformation. That's the next panel. And just to wrap, yes, the Middle East has witnessed a lot of wars, but also conflict and discussions and polarization and dialogue has also led to some good change around this part of the world. And all of it is because of listening, reconciling, and talking about things and sitting together and confronting each other peacefully. Thank you all for participating in this panel. We'll be taking questions, I think, after an hour from now. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Amanda. And I think the whole team is happy because we're right on time. The next panel will be coming up in a few seconds.
Incredible. Thanks, Rima, Amanda, and Eric. And we'll have that conversation on the AGLN website for you to watch again. Now we turn to a story of fellows who came together to address needs in their country that weren't being met. What happens when fellows combine their superpowers and work towards a common goal? We'll see with Todo Panama.
When the pandemic hit Panama, we were totally unprepared. With a weak public health system for a population of less than 4.3 million people at the time, we had less than 5,000 hospital beds, less than 400 ICUs, and only 550 ventilators. The communication the government was giving was not aligning with the reality of the majority of the people. The motto, stay at home, was simply not a reality for the majority of the population. And it was creating two bands, the bands that could stay at home and the bands that couldn't. Also, there was little information at the time on how to protect oneself of the virus and how the virus was spreading. That created an opportunity for the private sector to start uniting in response to this pandemic to see what we could do to help the response of the government.
As soon as we started collaborating years ago in Cali activities and building our community in Panama, the Cali Fellowship in Panama, I realized that it was better. It was better to work in groups of fellows. And because we all come from very different backgrounds, you can pick and choose what superpower do you need to access to create this, better idea lab. The spark of creating communication strategy under the umbrella of Todo Panama, which, by the way, Todo Panama means the whole of Panama. And when we collaborate, we learn, we grow, and we create better ideas, better solutions.
We discovered that this will be much bigger than we thought. Main objectives of the program was to control the pandemic in Panama, to reduce the mortality, and to avoid the hospitalizations related to COVID.
What we really wanted was to create trust. In order to create trust, one must enter spaces and conversations with a beginner's mindset, with thinking that the other people in the room have something to teach us. The second ingredient of actively and deeply listening, what you can learn about the other person. And by listening, one could actually find a lot of common ground. And when you find that common ground, that's when you start building trust.
Todo Panama indeed means that we have representation from all kinds of groups, professionals, doctors, lawyers, politicians, religions, but they are indeed Todo Panama. We impacted more than 65,000 people who live in this region. We also raised more than $3 million in cash, plus more than 5 million in aids, medical supplies, food, timer in social media, television, radio, newspaper, and this is not counting the time and the expertise of all the people who work for Todo Panama.
Everything that we have accomplished and what we are is based on the sum of the efforts, the time, and the resources of strategic partners, the alliances, donors, volunteers, people working in the project. And now we have evolved into the vaccination campaign that it's vacúnate y vence in Spanish, which means vaccinate yourself and conquer. This is evolving, it's not static, it has had a lot of impact. We took a concept that I deeply believe, that is that we're stronger together, that we can accomplish more by working together, and we did it.
We'll hear more from Ana Maria later. This week, leaders will be hosting workshops and conversations in Agora, a new space on the AGLN website where they can come together and find collaborators. Let's take a look at some of the topics they're working on.
My name is Bo Bai. I'm an Aspen China Fellow. I'm the chairman and co-founder of CTX. As we all know that we're facing the global warming issues, and then carbon and carbon-related global trading has been very fragmented. You don't have a global carbon trading system yet. A blockchain is fully utilized to benefit from its immutability. It's a distributed storage system, and then that coupled with an exchange that is regulated by the regulator can provide a profound impact. So we very much trying to build an ecosystem for all people to benefit from technology, while at the same time use their own behavior to drive more capital to green projects, to drive more activities to neutralize their carbon footprint, and then to do well and then to do good at the same time. I welcome everybody to join us on the Agora session on July 23rd, and then to participate in a fantastic conversation to drive green financing, to drive sustainable development through technology with the blockchain and many others. So join us.
Hey everyone, my name is Jim Stritzinger. I'm a Liberty Fellow in the class of 2006. I'm the director of the South Carolina Broadband Office here in Columbia, South Carolina, and I'd like to welcome you to a topic, Global Universal Broadband, that I work on a daily basis. It's certainly confusing and complex. There are engineering issues, we call those access issues. There are affordability issues and digital literacy, we call those adoption issues. And then you add in all the confusing terms and terminology, low Earth orbit satellites and things like 5G, and it gets complicated really fast. So to help us all come together and discuss it, I've assembled a team of experts. I have a friend from Ookla that's an expert on global network performance. I have a friend from the IBM Research Center in New York that's fabulous, understands this topic really well. I have two people from Land O'Lakes that are experts in global placemaking, and a colleague at the Pew Charitable Trust in Washington, D.C. that talks about public policy and works on that on a daily basis. So join me on July 22nd, and we're going to unpack this issue. I hope it's interesting to you, and we're going to make a real difference. Thanks so much.
Hi, my name is Megan Ranney. I'm an emergency physician, director of the Brown Lifespan Center for Digital Health, and a member of the 5th class of the Health Innovators Fellowship. My session is around redefining firearm injury as a public health problem. I'm hoping to get a number of fellows and other interested folks from across the AGLN network to join me in talking through how we can move beyond the same old tired debates between gun rights and gun control into a discussion of true gun safety. This, by necessity, includes firearm experts, medical experts, public health experts, just members of the general public, but most of all, it requires an open mind and a willingness to engage in the types of deep conversations that we love so much here at Aspen. Please join me in Agora.
Those are just 3 collaborations happening this week. Check out more on the Agora page on the AGLN website. Now we go to a different kind of pandemic, that of disinformation. We are living through a time where the unintended consequences of our technology are outpacing our ability to keep up. The results? Fake news, echo chambers, truth decay. Our faith and trust in institutions and each other are actively being eroded. Here to explore these ideas further and what we can do about it is Vivian Schiller, Executive Director of Aspen Digital. She's leading an effort to identify the causes of information disorder and respond to this modern day crisis of faith. Vivian, welcome.
Thank you, Phil. And hi, everybody. I'm really, really glad to be here. What a wonderful program, and so nice to see all your faces from all over the world. So as Phil mentioned, we are here to talk about the crisis of what we call information disorder. And to be clear, there has always been mis and disinformation. This is not a new phenomenon. What is new is these powerful machines that we all carry in our pockets that enable so much good and so much convenience also deliver us tremendous harm, particularly at the hands of those who would try to deceive us or tear us apart for reasons of either ideology or profit. We are literally seeing the foundation of agreed upon evidence-based reality erode before our eyes. But in this session, we're not here to admire the problem. We could spend the next 20 minutes just talking about all the ways that we're seeing this play out and how bad it is. But instead, what we want to do in this conversation is we want to focus on how we see our way out. So luckily, we have just the three leaders who can help us do that. Govind Ettaraj is an award-winning journalist and founding editor of India Spend, which is India's first data journalism project. And he is the founder also of Ping Digital Broadcast, a network for knowledge, news, and utility programming for digital audiences. Marla Blow is president and chief operating officer of the Skoll Foundation. She's also a Henry Crown Fellow, widely recognized as a leading executive in the finance industry. She was, until very recently, the US head for the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. Yasmin Green is the director of research and development for Jigsaw, which is a unit within Alphabet focused on solving global security challenges through technology. Yasmin has led some incredible projects in some of the world's toughest parts of the world, focusing on things like countering online extremism and radicalization. I should also mention that both Marla and Yasmin are members of the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder, which is an 18-member group that is focusing and will be delivering solutions for government, civil society, and private industry on the very issues we are here discussing on this panel. Okay, let's get into it. Govind, I want to start with you. So you have seen sort of radical growth of mis and disinformation in India, particularly in recent years, particularly in the last year. It is now, as you've told me in conversation, embraced as a political strategy. So how do we help audiences? How do we help the public be more critical, discerning, and media literate consumers of the information that they see online?
Thank you so much, Vivian. So there is I think you've talked about the supply problem, and then there is the demand side. So the supply side is something that we are going to fight for many, many years. And I don't know with how much success, but we obviously hope that we'll make some headway. I started two initiatives. One is called factchecker.in, where we fact check statements made by people in public life, and another initiative called Boom Live, where we fight misinformation or fake news and bust fake news, and also try and explain issues. So these are the two initiatives where we actually take the whole problem of misinformation and active disinformation head on. Now, in India, we have now close to 500 million smartphones. Smartphones equals internet equals WhatsApp, which is one of the primary disseminators of misinformation and disinformation. Obviously, the fact that it is peer-to-peer encrypted helps that it all remains in the netherworld, so to speak, influences people, and yet is not seen by anyone, including mainstream media or, let's say, the cadres of journalists who might do something about it. But the other problem is that even if they were to, they're not really trusted. So to fight the problem on the supply side is going to take a lot, and it is going to take more active collaboration and proactive action by the social platforms, who in some ways are the source of the problem, are doing something about it, but maybe obviously they need to move faster. But what we are doing, for instance, apart from fighting those who are in actively, let's say, generating that misinformation is to actually take them on and call them out on social media. So what we do is to identify those habitual offenders and keep calling them out and put pressure. So in some ways, that's attacking one end of the problem. But that's still on the supply side. On the demand side, what we've been doing is two things. One is we've been trying to work with children, which has slowed down now a little bit because of COVID, and see whether we can hold short workshops and try and see if we can gamify the process of consuming information, identifying what's wrong, and then making the whole thing a little bit of fun so that they actually start to make it part of their thinking and their process of critical thinking, which we hope they will develop. And that we've maybe reached a few thousand children, mostly in the city of Mumbai. What we've done more recently with the advent of COVID and the challenges of vaccination is with a small grant from the McNulty Foundation, actually launched an effort to target senior citizens. So we signed up and signed on a well-known actor from a popular soap of the 90s, a soap series which was very popular in India called Hum Log in India. And we worked with him to create a whole campaign around getting vaccinated, not trusting misinformation, not ignoring your WhatsApp messages, particularly from within your community. We also simultaneously, and I'll pause after this, have launched a series of workshops. So we're trying to identify senior citizen influencers. And we're doing workshops with them across the country. So we worked with about 500 senior citizen influencers, as we call them, and again, done exhaustive workshops running for about 2 hours, using case studies, using popular examples, which are current, and then trying to explain what the problems are in the context of COVID-19 and vaccine misinformation. And these are the ways we feel, apart from, of course, working with platforms more closely, we can fight misinformation as it is today and hopefully achieve some result, but one step at a time.
Thanks, Govind. And I'm so glad to hear you say you're focusing not just on youth, but on senior citizens. The data show that in fact, in many parts of the world, I know for sure this is the case in the US, those are the sources of the spread of mis and disinformation. So it is not only about young people, though obviously that's very relevant. I also really like your framing around the supply side and the demand side. And Yasmin, in turning over to you, I know in your work, you are focusing on both. And I'll sort of ask you about both sides of the coin, which is help us with what the tech companies, the platforms can do to mitigate the spread of disinformation. So that addresses the supply side. And also talk to us about what your experience at Jigsaw tells us on the platforms are the supply side. I'm getting mixed up. But what does your experience at Jigsaw tell us about the demand side in terms of thwarting radicalization, and how can that help us with this spreading problem?
So I agree completely that Govind's framing and his activities resonate with me, and I'm so grateful that there's the civil society ecosystem that is doing the work to help thwart the spread of misinformation. I think from the platform perspective, the focus disproportionately, I think, of investment from the platforms, and also maybe even in the public discourse, has been around the role of algorithms. Both because algorithms are responsible for finding the content that the platforms say is not allowed and taking it off, and then also algorithms to recommend new content. So if you can improve the quality of algorithms, then you should be able to find more of the stuff that the platforms say shouldn't be there. And you can also be better at recommending content so that you're not, sending people down rabbit holes. And my observation and the empirical research does support this is that on both fronts, the algorithms are getting much more sophisticated. And we need algorithms to do this work, because when you have billions of new pieces of content created every day, you have to have a mechanism that scales to find it. So it's really impressive, stunning progress. And I think they'll get much more sophisticated still. And it won't be enough to tackle the misinformation problem, even with all that progress that's been made and will be made. And there are two reasons because of that. One is, there are two reasons why that's the case. One is that there's always a time lag for algorithms to be trained, because the way that
machine learning models, those algorithms are developed, is that they're given examples of content, for example, that isn't allowed, and then they go and look for it. But 2 years ago, there was no COVID-19 health misinformation. So 1.5 years ago, the algorithms were not very good at finding that stuff. So there's always a lag between when you want them to start to look for something and their efficacy. And then the other reason is that some misinformation is always borderline. It's not going to be against the policies. So I think on the supply side, those algorithms are doing a good job of mitigating the role of platforms in amplifying, and they'll do a better job, but it's insufficient. What I'm really excited about, and where we've done a lot of work at Jigsaw, is in the area of tools and context that users can be given in order to navigate misinformation more safely. And I do think that there's a huge opportunity that we've only scratched the surface of to help with the demand side. People all report caring about accuracy, but when you do research across countries like India, several countries that we've done surveyed in the east of Africa, in Kenya and on the east of Africa, and the US and elsewhere, we find that people say that they share misinformation, not because they always think it's true, but because they're proving a point about their patriotism, or they're doing some other kind of in-group signaling that's also important to them. So one of the things that we're experimenting with at Jigsaw, and we've partnered with academics at MIT, David Rand and Gordon Pennycook on this, is to test whether, if you can remind people of accuracy, because everyone says they care about it, they make better decisions about what to consume and what to share. And that has the added benefit that it is not a political intervention. An accuracy prompt is not the platform or the fact checkers or any institution telling you what to think. And that's really relevant when we look at people who are skeptical of institutions, are skeptical of platforms, and people who might be on the radicalization path, that we have to innovate new approaches to reach them and help them make better decisions in the moment around information.
Thanks, Yasmin. You raised so many interesting points, including in your first section around the difficulty of that. Yes, we need algorithms in order to solve this, but there is a time lag. There are also a lot of nuances around things. You know, where is the line between taking down things that are wrong, and how does that intersect or collide with people's rights to, or human rights to free expression? So difficult, and the role of human cognition as well. Marla, talk to us a little bit about the role that philanthropy can play. For instance, I know that Skoll is it has been focused for a long time on climate change and mis and disinformation about climate change. What does that experience tell us about how we can solve for the broader information crisis when it comes to things like COVID-19, public health, or even the trust in institutions and democracy itself?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you, Vivian. It's a great question, and I think it's a really important point. When we look at this, we think about trust, agency, and equity in how we can address some of the issues here. And in particular, the areas that you mentioned around climate and democracy and some of the other racial justice. What we found is disinformation has a kind of worsening effect on deeply entrenched problems, right? Where there's the problem itself, and then there's the issue which exacerbates the problem, which in many cases ties into information integrity and information quality. So a lot of our effort has been on that trust component, on rebuilding the ability to believe the information that is being presented and understand what are quality sources of information, and ensuring that information is in alignment with the reality that is important to understand as we go about addressing these really important issues. So as we have worked in areas like climate change for extensive periods of time, and Yasmin, I'll retract what I said earlier, it's been 15 years since An Inconvenient Truth came out, so we can feel a little bit better about how long that's been. But it points to the importance of getting credible voices in front of large audiences to tell the story of the challenge and build buy-in and demonstrate that this is a problem that affects all, and that it is important that we bring equity into that equation as well. There are many voices that have not been able to participate effectively in this information ecosystem
for long periods of time, right? This is not a recent problem. This is a long-standing problem. And ensuring that there is some equity in the case of Skoll, and the way that foundations and other nonprofit actors can play a role is bringing those missing voices into the conversation, creating and funding the kinds of outlets that will allow for those stories to be told, and be told by the people that are proximate and directly affected by the challenges. And so whether that is about being disenfranchised and being removed from the ability to vote, or being put in a position where your rights, your human rights, are being violated on the basis of race. Those are stories that are missing and that have been deliberately excluded. And through our work in the foundation and in philanthropic areas, there's the opportunity to do a little bit of course correcting on that and bring some of those voices into the table. And then the last piece I really want to highlight is about the system itself, and building a robust system and creating the kinds of structural pieces within the system that will allow for the integrity to be restored where it may have been undermined. There's a long history of public media that you can go back to, NPR, I think was founded in 1970, right, by an act of Congress. ProPublica has been around now for almost 15 years. There are new and bigger opportunities now coming with new platforms, and some of the innovation in media I think is really interesting around this, to create other avenues and sources that are accountable, that are able to then demonstrate that they are focused on truth, and that they are focused on sort of bipartisan or kind of not the editorializing that really is a big part of the problem, because it is important to recognize, as we've talked about in the commission, that even the truth can be used in ways that ultimately mislead, right, and create misinformation. And so that there's an editorializing piece, there's a presentation piece that is a critical consideration as well. And foundations and philanthropy have been intricately interwoven in all of that over the course of long periods of time.
You raised so many excellent points, Marla, including about equity, which is not just about having voices of those who directly affected represented, but also the real world harms to underrepresented communities. But I just want to sort of double down on your last point about media. Of course, that's an area near and dear to my heart as I come from the news media, but the collapse really of independent news media in local communities all over the United States. It is the same in India. In India, you have, as we had in the last administration in the US, really threats to independent media coming from the highest reaches of government is really creating a vacuum into which so much mis and disinformation flow. We only have a couple of minutes, so let me just open it up for a couple of other questions. What can individuals do? I mean, so many people I talk to feel helpless. They feel like they are not the bad actors, but they don't know how to respond to this flood of information, and they're seeing their maybe family members or old friends or college classmates who they see falling into this trap. And especially we have all these AGLN fellows on the phone who have on the call, who have platforms, they've run businesses and organizations. What can any individual do to have an impact? And I'll open it up to any of you to take that on.
Well, I'll start and give others a moment to think about it, and a very short one, which is really to take a moment and think before you decide to forward and share information. It is one of the things that the platforms now have created is ruthlessly efficient ability to distribute information. And we all play a role in that. And if you can just pause for a second and think about right before you hit like or forward or share or agree, think a moment and just make sure that you understand what is the source of this, what is the intent behind this, right? What are the possible other interpretations of what might be going on, and just kind of understand your own role in this efficiency that allows the spread of information to happen this way.
Govind, you must touch on this in your literacy work with both senior citizens and youth.
And that's exactly what we say. And I think Marla summed it up very well. So I think there is a distinction between education and digital literacy, or literacy and digital literacy. And I think we have to appreciate that difference and then work on making people digitally literate.
And the other thing is, I think, how do you develop critical thinking? Now, it sounds like a very grandiose term, but it is the foundational problem that we are grappling with, and it has to be brought into whether it's young children or school children or older college students, older people. That's really what we have to work towards and hopefully achieve something.
That's great. And Yasmin, I know this is an area of focus for you as well. With just our 15 seconds or so remaining, would you like to just add anything to?
So just that, I just look forward to innovations on the platform side that make the work of Govind and Marla and other, civil society practitioners more efficient. They shouldn't feel like they're working against the platform's designs. We should all be working in concert. And I think we're moving in that direction. So I'm optimistic.
Thank you. And I know you're a big part of that. Marla, Govind, Yasmin, thank you so much. What a rich conversation. I wish we had more time to talk, but with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Phil.
Thank you. Awesome. Thanks, Vivian. That was great. Govind, Marla, Yasmin, thank you so much for your insights there. There's a lot more to discuss. And if you're in the Action Forum Zoom room, join them in the Q&A after for a deeper dive. Okay, so with all this talk of mistrust, how do we start building trust? In a minute, we'll explore this topic more with Henry Crown Fellow Shamina Singh, founder and president of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, and Tashara Jones, Rodell Fellow and the mayor of St. Louis, Missouri. But first, for a group of fellows in the United States, building trust is about righting a historic wrong and restoring the institutions that are vital to strong communities. Let's learn about the National Black Bank Fund.
Trust with financial institutions in the Black community has always been a challenge from the beginning of our experiment of being Americans. After the Civil War, this country created a Freedmen's Bureau. And the first Black bank president was Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. And Frederick Douglass, on his own accord, realized that the Freedmen's Bureau was a Ponzi scheme. Frederick Douglass goes to Congress and he says, I can't invest or ask my people to invest another dime in this bank. And Congress, at the stroke of a pen, closed the Freedmen's Bureau. And in closing the Freedmen's Bureau, half of Black wealth in this country was wiped away. At that time, African Americans were 0.5% of America's wealth, 0.5. Today, we're just 1%. Every generation of African Americans has had a story, a headline about why their generation was being denied access to opportunity through financial institutions. When you think about the three-legged stool of the Black community, you have your Black banks, historically Black colleges, and our faith-based institutions. They all are very critical to the culture, to the sustainability of our community. And when you look at Black banks, you're looking at institutions that aren't just looking at your credit score. They represent the will and self-determination of those communities. So when we find ourselves with only 18 Black banks left, we have to ask the fundamental question, do we want to live in a country where we're the last generation to know that Black banks existed? I wanted to be a part of something that could change the world, but I wanted to do it with friends. And that's exactly what I've been able to do with the National Black Bank Foundation.
This conversation started in a march, really, to protest the death of George Floyd. It was a moment that I think everyone was searching for answers in their personal lives as well as in their professional lives to say, how can you make a difference? And so when we were on that march, we said, look, how can the Atlanta Hawks help? And we thought, well, maybe we'll make a deposit or maybe we'll do a line of credit. This idea to actually refinance the practice facility where our players practice, that was a real estate deal that importantly could be a model, right, for not just what other teams can do, what other businesses can do.
When it came time to create this, the people around me from the Aspen Global Leadership Network were so similarly situated. They think the same. They know the world is big and full of big challenges, but it can be overcome with big ideas. So I went into the lab and talked to Yolanda Daniel and Lauren McCann and Tashara Jones and Branda Comer, and we came up with a way to say that what if we brought to the Hawks not one Black bank, but more than half the Black banks in this country to do one deal.
The Atlanta Hawks deal really sets the table for Black banks to participate in financing major deals across the country. The lack of Black financial institutions has contributed to the racial wealth gap over generations. And in my opinion, reducing the racial wealth gap is directly tied to racial justice and economic justice. We are taking it upon ourselves to start the National Black Bank Fund and Foundation to expand the capacity of Black banks to make sure that every major city has a Black bank in their neighborhood. Getting access to capital through deals like the Atlanta Hawks deal allows Black banks to increase their capacity to provide more services and hopefully to shrink the racial wealth gap because they'll be able to lend to communities that they serve.
This is a $35 million commercial real estate loan with a lot of different complications. It was historic because not only was one of the smallest Black-owned banks, Carver, able to provide the leadership role and put the syndicate together, but we were able to bring 10 banks together in this historic opportunity, which was the first to ever finance a major facility for a major American sports franchise. It brings us the ability to be able to demonstrate to the larger financial community and the larger business community that our banks are just as sophisticated. We can handle the sophisticated deals and complicated transactions that any other institution can handle.
This is good business, right? There's no excuse, right, that other businesses can't do the exact same thing that we've been able to do when you have the commitment and you put the resources behind it.
Martin Luther King, in his last speech before he was assassinated, talked about a banking in movement. It is that exact movement that we're trying to keep going today.
Hello, Aspen community and my fellow fellows. My name is Shamina Singh, and I made an action pledge last year on behalf of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth that launched the Global Inclusive Growth Spark Grants with the goal of lifting all of you up around the world who are advancing sustainable and equitable economic growth and, of course, financial inclusion. I'm thrilled to report back that 1 year later, we have honored 4 incredible inaugural winners from the US, South Africa, and Hong Kong, including the National Black Bank Fund, featured in the video that you just saw. We're also really excited to announce that we are supporting Spark Grants again in 2021. Applications are now open through August 15th, so please, fellows, tell us about the amazing work you're doing and head on over to the AGLN website to sign up. But most importantly, I have the honor and privilege to now be in conversation with one of those 2020 Spark Grant recipients and leaders of the National Black Bank Foundation, Tachara Jones. She's also the newly elected mayor of St. Louis and a Rodell Fellow. Mayor Jones, it is wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us.
Well, thank you for having me. Good to see you.
I'm going to jump into 2 questions because this is a Spark Talk. So here we go. So the first question, Mayor Jones, what do you see as the connection between financial security and social stability? And what does that mean for the people of St. Louis and your term as mayor?
Yes, again, thank you for having me, and it's good to see all of the fellows. I think the biggest connection between financial stability or security and social stability is predictability and reliability. People who have financial security obviously have predictability and reliability in their income, and social stability is the degree to which those are present in our institutions. And unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people experience both financial security and social stability at the same time. And so I think it's my job as mayor to show that these things are possible, to create an environment where financial security and social stability can exist by developing trust in our institutions and having our actions speak louder than words. And again, creating an environment where they're all possible.
it's interesting you should say that. I can't agree more. And I'd also say that I think that the research at the center that we found, even as far away as the Arab Spring, was that uprising was really about economic uncertainty and economic exclusion, which almost fed right into the social instability. So this notion of having both at the same time, I can't agree more, is primarily important and such a great role for you to take on as mayor. And speaking of institutions, Mayor Jones, you know, we live in a world where people are increasingly losing trust in institutions and in the other. How do you think we move from social stability to greater social trust? And what role does trust in institutions play in creating stronger, more inclusive communities?
Well, I'll have to be frank with you. I don't blame people for not having trust in institutions and the other. I'm from Missouri, and Missouri is what we call the show me state. And so our actions have to speak louder than our words. A lot of times people look at politicians like myself who make all of these campaign promises on the trail, and then when we get in office, don't deliver on those promises. And so we have to keep our word. Our actions have to speak louder than our words by creating an environment that leads with racial equity at the center through our policies, through our spending, and through our intentional investments in communities that have been left behind and ignored by their governments for far too long.
So what I'm hearing from you today, Mayor Jones, is pretty impactful. Reliability, predictability, stability, security, and keeping your word. Those are 5 phrases to live by, and I am in awe and so honored that you spent some time with us today, and we all look forward to watching you lead as Mayor of St. Louis. Thank you so much for your time, Mayor Jones.
Awesome. Thank you, Shamina and Mayor Jones. And what a great primer for us to dive deeper into this topic of trust. Who better to do that with than my friend and colleague, Michael Scholar, director at Weave, the Social Fabric Project here at the Institute. It's a program that believes stronger communities begin with trust. Michael, welcome. How's it going?
It's going well. Thank you, Phil. And I'm happy to fill in as moderator for my colleague, Frederick Riley, who was called away on a family emergency. In the interview we just saw, Mayor Jones talked about the importance of predictability, reliability, and security in people's lives. If you don't have those, it's hard to have faith or trust in institutions or in other people. As we've been hearing all day, we're living through a crisis of trust. A 2017 Pew Center study of 38 countries found that on average, just 14% of people have a lot of trust in their governments to do the right thing. In a 2018 Pew Center study, it found that more than a third of Americans have low trust in other Americans. Worse yet, nearly half of young adults under 30 fell into that low trusters group. By the way, those surveys in the US were done before the pandemic, and they were done before this last election. So as change leaders, that makes our jobs tough. Reverend Jen Bailey of the Faith Matters Network once said, "Social change moves at the speed of relationships, and relationships move at the speed of trust." It may not be in our job descriptions, but as leaders, we have to start with trust. We created Weave, the Social Fabric Project here at the Aspen Institute to take on the trust crisis. The solution, we believe, starts locally. In every community that we've looked at, we see people, often quietly, building connection with others by focusing on what we share rather than on how we differ. They extend an arc of trust in ever-widening circles to include people from different backgrounds and different experiences. We call these folks weavers, and our project exists to connect them, to support them, and to inspire new generations of weavers. You can learn more about our work at weareweavers.org. I'm honored to be with 2 of the weavers you've already met in videos today. We saw the work Ana Maria Vallarino is doing with the Todo Panama civic movement. She's also president of the Verde Azul Foundation and a Central America Leadership Initiative Fellow. Ashley Bell spoke of his work with the Black Bank Fund and Foundation. He's also founder of the 2020 Bipartisan Justice Center focused on criminal justice reform and a civil society fellow.
Ana Marie, I'll start with you. Your work with Todo Panama brought community voices to the table around COVID-19 so people could be part of the decisions that affect their lives. What did you and others have to do to create enough trust in those people so they would join the process?
Thank you, Michael, and good morning to everyone. Like you said and you mentioned, we were working together in group in a big coalition. We brought to the table key stakeholders. It was not only about the fellows of the Central America Leadership Initiative working together, it was with the private sector, the nonprofit, civic groups, civil society, unions. We were bringing everybody to the table and giving them voice. Also, we understanding that to generate trust, it takes time. And due to the urgency of the situation, we had to leverage on the trust our allies already had. And with that, we also made sure that we had a basic legal and governance structure to give this transparency and accountability that is also important to generate trust. But the most important in terms of building trust with the community, like already Eric Liu mentioned it, we were listening and listening to understand, not to fix, not to prove our point, not to answer back, but really to understand the barriers, to understand the circumstances, the communities we were aiming to serve were living, the fears they had, recognizing that these fears were real and not just dismissing them. So it was really important to come to the table wholeheartedly to listen, to caring, to listen what they had to say. And we did it not only with the communities, but also with our donors, asking for feedback and advice in other countries to see what they were doing. So we came in with this learning mentality instead of a knowing mentality. It was more important to getting it right the first time because we had no time to do those changes. We needed to get it right instead of being right.
So you noted that trust takes time. And I think that's often something that as leaders, we often feel pressed by time. And so being able to slow down the clock and just pay attention to the relationships is critical. You also mentioned leveraging the trust of others. And I imagine when you talk about bringing all the stakeholders in and doing a lot of listening, that part of what you're doing is you're bringing the people in who already have trust with communities you're trying to reach.
Not only with the communities, the nonprofits were a big help in that because they already had done the work of being in these communities for a long periods of time, but also the trust on donors because we needed the funds to carry on the programs and the initiatives. We needed the help of volunteers. And with that, the civic groups that came in, so they were the ones that were rallying up the volunteers. So really, we needed to work together and understanding that others that had already a time being in their different fields had already done the work of creating this trust.
Thank you. Ashley, you work with people who have centuries of good reason to mistrust the system. What do you say and do to inspire people to invest in trusting and engaging?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, it is a complicated one because when you have decades of mistrust because of systems that have failed people, when people who are in underserved communities know that the system works, but it just doesn't work for them, it's a challenge. And where we start is finding friends of goodwill. For all of those who are willing to stand up for injustice, willing to join in the fight of curing our systems of these systemic inequalities, it's about being there for the march, being there for the protests, but what happens after that is even more important. And so the trust is that you'll be there on social media applauding new efforts as they emerge around the world to create justice, but also as you applaud that you actually are willing to stick around and do the work. I think people who are disenfranchised, people who
live in these underserved communities around the world are used to a quick fad of someone being excited or empowered or just, just engaged during the moment of distress. But what happens next? And I think what we were able to show with the Black Bank Foundation is that we marched after George Floyd was murdered together with people of all backgrounds across political spectrums. But after the march was the meeting. The meeting was where we had a commitment, not just for that day, but for years to come. And I think as we all think about where we have stood in times of crisis around the world, that we ask ourselves, where is our true commitment? Have we truly dedicated our time, our resources, and our talents to those causes long term? And what does that look like?
People can sense that deep commitment. And so, as you say, kind of showing up after the march, after, the cameras are off, and showing that you're sticking with them, I think is so crucial, as you said, to kind of building trust. I'd like to go to the personal level. Ana Maria, how do you muster the resilience to give trust and to model it, especially when you're dealing with people who, shall we say, resist change, to put it mildly?
I think we all resist change in a level. That's what makes us human. And also our fears and our past experiences, our traumas, everything builds up this complexity of being human. And recognizing that I myself, for example, when I was in early 2019, when I was diagnosed with a sarcoma in the blood vessels of my liver, I was forced to stop and understand that I was not this superwoman, understand that I was so focused on fixing things and fixing others, and really people and things don't need fixing, right? And we can only work on ourselves. So what I have done and worked for me, at least a game changer in my experience, is turning into myself, self-awareness. And how can I, instead of forcing, provoking that trust, inspiring that trust, and doing is showing myself and that vulnerability, that with my light and my darkness, and sharing it. And when I open up to share the thing that, I'm a perfectly imperfect, and the things that I don't know, but I want to learn, that creates a safe space for others to also open up. And when we start sharing more than what we do and what we believe, but the small stuff, and when we start interacting to really get to know each other, that's what I've seen, that trust starts building. We start creating these connections that we see that we have a lot of things in common with people that sometimes we feel that, oh my God, I cannot believe what he's thinking, what he's doing. But when we sit down and we start engaging in these conversations, recognizing our human dignity, we start generating these connections. And I love a phrase that Brené Brown says, that it's really hard to hate up close, so move in. So every time I'm in a situation when I don't understand where that person is coming from, or it's making me feel uncomfortable, I turn to myself to see, why am I feeling uncomfortable in this situation? And also, why is this person really trying to understand and know? And at the end, it's about individuals. It's about people. And that's how we start generating one by one. We start generating that trust.
And it's so easy to forget that it's about individuals. What you said earlier really struck me, that we often go into a mindset where people and things need fixing, and they don't need fixing. They need to be related to. So thank you. Ashley, how about you? In your criminal justice reform work, do you offer trust, or do you wait till it is earned? What do you try to model in your work?
Well, a big similarity between my work with 2020 Bipartisan Justice Center and the National Black Bank Foundation is being intentional about working with people who have different ideologies and different political backgrounds. Both organizations were founded by people who are conservative and liberal. You have to really sit down and ask yourself, what's bigger than politics? What's bigger than our divides? There may be 10 things we 10 big issues. 8 of them we may disagree on fundamentally, but 2 we may, and that's where we can find common ground. But I think it begins many times with understanding that history matters. And when you look back at history and you understand the different experiences of people in your community, that we all may have different roads, but we're on the same journey. Everybody wants happiness. Everybody wants to have a family and a community that they can, find fulfillment. And when you look at the history of how our criminal justice system has failed so many people, how Jim Crow has had a devastating effect on America, but Jim Crow had relatives that live in South Africa, that live in India, that live in England, and how these underserved communities around the world, if you can listen and understand how we got to where we are, then I think that's where trust begins, with that transparency, with that understanding that I'm going to take the time to understand how we got here. And then once everybody at least understands how we got to where we are right now, then you can have an honest conversation about where you go next. Because it's important to recognize why people distrust. And when you can recognize and identify that, then you can unpack how do you rebuild it. And it begins with people who are willing to listen, to learn, and to love like the world depends on it, because it does.
Yeah, and also, again, when we're trying to solve problems, it's easy to forget or ignore the past and just focus on the present issues that are in our face. So that's a wonderful reminder that we have to understand where things came from and why they came from there. In the few minutes we've got left, I'm going to ask each of you, and start with you, Ashley, what will it take to create trust on a society-wide scale? And what 2 or 3 actions can leaders take to start building trust? Ashley, you up first.
We live in a world right now, we saw a complete, yeah, I'm here. So I was saying that we live in America, especially even around the world, in a reckoning with racial inequities. George Floyd, you see so many corporations that are making statements every day around the world about their commitment to justice and their commitment to equality. And I think that we finished the announcement phase. Now we're entering the accountability phase. So this is where trust has a chance to be sustained. This is where all of us, wherever we work, wherever we invest our time and our treasure, must hold the institutions accountable that said that they're going to support justice and a new way of living in this world and a new era of equality. Hold them accountable. Ask the questions. Where you work, where you spend your time, where you have faith, are their actions really reflective of all these statements? And are your values lined up with the organizations that you commit your time and talent? This is our moment to create trust. This is after the march. Now it's time to sign up for the future.
Wow, thank you. Ana Maria, what do you think it will take to create trust in your nation and other nations? And what 2 to 3 actions can leaders take to make that happen?
Thank you, Michael. I mean, at the end, like I mentioned before, nations, societies, institutions, and corporations are made of people. And it is going down to the individual level and rebuilding relationships. And like Ashley just mentioned, caring to ask those questions, caring enough to understand. I believe if we start focusing on the core, on the individual, and then start building up, then we can start building trust on a bigger level. And recommendations that I would give is you can't orchestrate from the top. Get proximate, get to know the people you work with, the communities you serve, and at the same time, normalize asking questions. Let it create that safe space for not knowing, but the importance of wanting to learn, wanting to understand. And the only way to understand is to ask questions. And at the same time, and this is something that we do a lot in Todo Panama, at least with the different teams of the committees, we have a classroom mentality that we all come in to learn, but we also have a recess, like we call it the recreo in Spanish, the recess, where we do the small talk, where we engage in these conversations to know how the others are doing, what they're feeling, and if we saw a movie or a new something, because that starts generating this, we start knitting together this relationship that it is much more
about what we are doing, but we care enough to do it together and stick together in the long run.
I love the idea of making sure we all have time for recess, and we'll get that a little bit after the question and answer period. Thank you, Anna Marie and Ashley. Your work is inspiring, and I think it will help us ensure that trust is part of our work plans as leaders. And thanks to all of you working to weave connection in your communities. I look forward to conversations with you over the next few days. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the breakout room where we'll answer some questions in just a few minutes.
Thanks, Michael, Anna Maria, and Ashley. We'll see you in the Q&A. And man, what a great way to end our day today. Thank you all for joining us. Come back on Sunday, on July 25th, where we'll start exploring how to sustain yourself as a leader, what it means to lead collectively, and how to build relationships, and how those relationships can take a great idea global. See you in the breakout rooms, and thank you. Have a great Action Forum.